I want to talk this morning about the end of suffering. It's something I'd like you to keep in mind. Is in the Kesa verse that we recite, how great and wondrous are the close of enlightenment. The second line is formless, yet embracing every treasure. And what I would like you to keep in mind is that it does embrace every treasure, and it is formless. So if we're going to explore the end of suffering, we need to explore the formless. And that can be unsettling. But it helps if we remember that it embraces every treasure. It does. I think one of the central causes of suffering is our sense of identity. And in our world today, identity has become something that I think people have tried to make sacred. And I think I have some understanding of why that may be. That if your identity, your sense of yourself has not been recognised, then it's necessary that it be recognised. It's necessary that in some way or another society improves itself so people are not excluded, but identities are not lost. But do identities define us? I don't think so. I think we find it like there's a gaping hole left if we say that, well, I'm a man, I'm Scottish, I'm English, I'm gay, I'm straight, whatever. Okay, there's various ideas that we have, various perceptions of ourselves that we have, that we describe by using that kind of language. Because in some ways that kind of language is needed. We need to recognise identity in that way, because we are Scottish or English or black or white or, all the other ways that things can be divided out. And yet still, however long the description may be that we give ourselves of who we are, of what we are, I don't think it never really scratches the surface, because in some ways it's sort of it's out there somewhere. It's not in an interior thing. And yet there is I find that there's something about identity that I cling to, and when I get angry or upset or distressed, there's a sense of identity at the heart of that. This is not something to be dismissed and say, identity, no, we don't do identity, we're Buddhists, no, God help us, we don't do that. And yet there's something here that if we want to know the end of suffering, there's something really quite important that we need to get past or to see through. The Buddha didn't have a problem with talking about identity in the sort of general sense that I've been using it. He talked about a self, and he talked a great deal about not self. But it's like formless and embracing every treasure. To get to the every treasure, the real treasure in this sense, that gets blocked when we are understanding ourselves as an identity. Zazen is a essential guide in this, in the sitting. Instructions are, don't grab hold, don't push away. Or to put that in another form, don't make anything. Don't deny anything, but don't make anything. And when we take refuge in an identity, we make something. And this goes very deep, because our sense of the world is made up of our sense impressions, our perceptions, our feelings, and out of our perceptions and feelings come volitions and our consciousness. That tends to lead to a sense, quite visceral sense of being something in here. That I am the perceiver of my perceptions. I am the feeler, the one who feels the sensations that I experience. There's quite a strong identification there that goes beyond an intellectual idea. It's a viscerally felt thing. And sometimes it's almost like I am this thing in here looking out there. And what happens out there affects me. And there is that division. There is that sense of self-definition, that I am this and then the world is that. If you look carefully in Zazen, that does not occur unless we make it so. In other words, we can produce the sense of identity, but we don't have to. And I think a lot of training for me has been slowly coming to recognize what it means to make a self, to create a self. And indeed, more than that, to see how I break up the world into this thing and that thing, one thing and another. And like I'm saying, it's not that it's completely wrong that we can tell the difference between an apple and an orange. That would be absurd. But does it really matter whether I have an apple or an orange? No, not really. There's a way of being in the world that is not rooted in a sense of this visceral thing that is here. And it's this that is hurt, offended, upset, that feels disregarded. And what would it be like if we didn't do that, if we didn't have that? I think we maybe on some level are drawn to that and on some level repelled from that. And I think it's important that we recognize both the attraction and the repulsion that centers around this. It's frankly frightening to feel that, well, I don't know who I am. What? You're telling me that this thing that I've felt all my life is me. It's a bit of a fiction, actually. So, what's going on? Well, in Zazen, when you don't make something, how is it? And maybe you would struggle to reply to that question. In other words, struggle to put that into words. And yet, you have some sense of that. You have some intuition. you don't just disappear in a puff of smoke when you don't make yourself. So when not making, what is the world? There is no world to grasp, but that doesn't mean that we are nothing, the world is nothing. This is quite a difficult concept to get in one's mind. And I think it takes a while to work through what's involved in not making an identity, and certainly has for me. And I think this is something to take time to reflect on, to look at deeply, and do remember formless and embracing every treasure. When we make an identity, we actually divide ourselves from the world. While I am me, I am not you. And that imposes a certain take on the world. I'm defensive because, well, you know, I'm me, it's all I've got. I'll try to be good, try to be nice to the world, try to be compassionate. And often we are exhorted in Buddhism to be compassionate, yes. But what is it that actually stops us from being compassionate? Well, it's a fear of losing ourselves, I think. A fear that somehow it'll be a step too far. We won't be recognised anymore. It's too much. There needs to be, that somehow I need to be able to hold on to this thing. And actually Buddhism is asking us, the Buddha is asking us, well, hang on, look at that. Is that really what you want? The thing that actually causes the gap between, that makes a gap of you and the world. When we talk about emptiness in Buddhism, in some ways we're talking about emptiness of idea, emptiness of conception. More significantly, emptiness of appropriation. That we don't appropriate a self, we don't appropriate the world. And that's a different thing to depending upon this in here as being me. That's an appropriation. Okay? If you don't appropriate, in a way, you leave whatever it is that is here to the universe. You don't need to make it, you don't need to defend it in that sense. Once you have come to the point at which you can see that, and I think this has to be a personal thing. You can't say, well, I know I'm saying this to you, but I trust your practice. You can't say in general, oh, don't worry about identity, that's a load of nonsense. No, you'll get creamed, I think, if you do that, and perhaps justifiably so, because you're not. It's using one thing that is trying to get at something very deep, and using it in another context that it's not intended like that. I know one of the questions in delving into what is meant by the end of suffering has been the question, well, is it for me? In other words, will I find the end of suffering, or is it for the world? That the world will find the end of suffering. I've come to realise it's neither of those. But while I'm seeing this in here as one thing, the world as another, that is a pertinent question. Is it for this or is it for that? But once this is begun to be let go of, that question dissolves with it. One way of putting that is to say, it's not about what I want or desire or react in fear to something. It's what is good to do. And how do I know what is good to do? Well, I can't claim some miraculous way of discerning what is good to do. What for myself I know that I can do is I can let go of the defensive but not the holding on to the thing here, the making of separation. And if, to the extent to which I can let go of that, there is a connection. There's the possibility of, that there is an actuality of not dividing, of allowing it to be every treasure. And that's work in progress for me. It's not like I'm speaking to you from a perspective of having done this, job done. Now this is the pinnacle that I'm pointing to that you can now go to. No, there's something that continues here, and this is an important point: is that the world is not divided at all in reality. There isn't, on the one hand, as it were, where all Buddhism goes to, the end of suffering, and then there is suffering, and we have these two things. There's a way of mistaking the world that divides the world up into pieces, into bits, into identities. I don't think there's another way instead. It's just that, for me, I need to just not do that. Where I see I'm doing that, I need to, oh, right, okay. In other words, to put this in other language, cease from evil. I mean, evil is a big word. Maybe in this case it's slightly misapplied, but what I mean is it's enough to see what not to do. And there's something that trusts that what is good to do arises when I don't make problems. And it arises because we're connected. There is the divisions are self-made. It's true that other people will make divisions too, and we have to live in a world of divisions. And it can be easy to say, well, whose fault is it? And it doesn't get you very far. Whose fault is it? In some circumstances is a necessary question. I mean, we need to understand when things have gone wrong, what's gone wrong, to see how can we do this better. Very important. I think we come to see that more when we don't divide things up into guilt and innocence. There is a connectedness that can be there that facilitates understanding. And then it's out of that, again, what is good to do. As a kind of example of this, I want to take a bit more specific thing. In the precepts in the commentary on the precept, do not be angry, the commentary goes that there is no retiring, no going, no truth, no lie. There's a brilliant sea of clouds. There is a dignified sea of clouds. When you think about it, that's a very strange thing to say about do not be angry. And there's an awful lot packed in there. Do not be angry. There is no coming or going. You might say there is no advance or retreat. In other words, when I'm angry, do I go out or do I go in? Dogen is saying no. No truth, no lie. That's more difficult. We want there to be a truth, the truth. We want there to be, I want to be right. Not just because that will satisfy my ego, But I want to be right because I want to be right. I don't want to be wrong. I don't want to go around screwing people up or, messing the world up. I want to be on the right side of things. And yet, there's an identity there. I need to be right. And it's, as long as I need to be right, it's almost like there's a section of the world I over here I can't quite see. The bit that's telling me, well, okay, you might be all right, but have a look at this sort of thing. There's things that are hinting to us all the time, where when we are kind of trying to reinforce or live from this point inside, we're all the time kind of walking around a bit, with to some degree with blinkers, and it's hard to see what you don't see, of course. And then he says, there is a dignified sea of clouds, there's a brilliant sea of clouds. I think it's worth noting what he doesn't say. He doesn't say the sun is shining behind the clouds. He says there's a dignified sea of clouds. And I take that to mean that when we look at anger, there is a dignified sea of clouds. And that's not usually how we think of anger. Anger is, oh, no, we're supposed to be compassionate, so compassion, anger, oh, no, I don't want to be that. No, there is a dignified sea of clouds. There is a dignity in this. And if we fail to recognize the dignity, then we're, I think, going to be in a continuing warfare with anger. The dignity is the brilliant sea of clouds. And I think that points to how it is when anger arises and you sit, I don't mean necessarily literally sit down, but you sit in the interior, in the true sense of the term. You let go of the self element in there. And then what is there? There is a dignified sea of clouds. You can't lay hold of that and say, oh, my true nature is a dignified sea of clouds. That's straight back into identity. And yet there is a dignified sea of clouds. You can't grasp it. In some ways, you can't even identify it. When, in some of the scriptures, it talks about how the Buddha sees the world. And the Buddha often refers to himself as, how does the Tathagata see the world? And describes it in that kind of language. There is nothing to hold on to, and yet everything is given. And when we look at everything, there is nothing to hold on to, and everything is given. There is an end of suffering. I used to not really believe that, to be honest, because it seemed, sometimes people that you meet that claim to know the end of suffering. Really? And also it's like, well, what about what's going on in Gaza? What's going on, left, right, and centre in our world? How can you say there's an end of suffering? To deny all that makes no sense. And yet there's something here that is of profound importance and profound value that enables us to live in the world as true beings. We don't need to make the self that suffers. From one perspective, that is asking us to give up a hell of a lot. It's asking us to give up absolutely everything. Because all that we have, that we think we have, is involved. That's what makes this. That's what makes identity. And yet, in the doing, we find that it's not like that at all. That actually, we never needed all that in the first place, that was the illusion. And that what this is pointing to in terms of the end of suffering is the undivided. And the utter sufficiency of undividedness, or to put it another way, the utter sufficiency of reality. And by reality, I mean what is not made, what is not compounded. In other words, not put together out of, me and something. Not created in the sense of something that I have taken and made my sense of who and what I am out of, all these components. I identify with this, with that, with the other. And still, I grew up in England. I have an English accent. I have certain ways of thinking that are still very much present. All sorts of things that, yes, you could say there's an identity, and that's fine. But from the inside out, do I see a self or not? Well, sometimes yes. I mean, it's definitely. But at other times, well, I don't ask the question because it doesn't arise. If you're sitting in Zazen, you don't ask yourself, am I making a self or am I not making a self? I mean, off you go. You just leave that. You trust whatever this all is, if you like, to the universe. I think actually it's enough that we trust reality. Something I've come to think of as reality confidence, as rather than self-confidence. I think as we are developing as human beings, we need self-confidence in the sense that a growing child or a growing adult needs some sense of self-confidence in the way that is normally used in the world. It makes sense. There's something there that is, I think we recognise instinctively is true. There's something that's important. I'm not trying to deny that. I'm saying let's not stop there. Let's not make that the sacred definition of what it is to be a being. There is a whole other thing, because if we stay there, life becomes something about the preservation of identity. We hold on to this because it's all we've got. And what I'm saying is, no, that's not how it is. That actually, perhaps we have to first of all form an identity in order to let it go. Maybe that's the way, the rather naughty way that humans are. And so it's not helpful to deny identity. And yet for ourselves, we need to see more deeply than that if we want to come to the end of suffering. And it is a different world. I think there's a kind of, well, there is a deep shift that training enables. If we understand what's going on, if we understand the purpose, if we understand what training is pointing to in this kind of letting go. And the shift is a movement from seeing the world as a world of things. And it's profound the way that we see the world as in its deepest sense. You have to know that anger and the brilliant sea of clouds are not two things. That is asking a lot, but that's the direction. And when you don't divide things like that, you're not creating the conflict, anger, compassion. There's actually nothing to hold on to, and there is the ongoing flow of conditions, if you like, the ongoing flow of life, in which stuff's happening all the time. We encounter it all the time. And it, in one sense, seems to call forth from us some sort of a response. Okay, well, that's one way of thinking about it. And in responding to life, I think we do so much better if that response is out of our connection, out of not needing to make that division into this and that, and we can know that such a thing is possible. It is actually possible to sit and not make a self, even if it's just momentary. And you don't need to be judging everything. Oh, was I making self? Wasn't I making self? No, that when it's going on, it's enough to let it go, see it, and then recognize. And having recognised it, in a certain sense, you've already let it go. Just move on. Don't sort of obsess over it. There is a teaching in Buddhism that things don't exist in the sense that in one moment something comes into being, it exists for a while, and then it goes out of existence at some point. The way this is sometimes described, that's other than that, is what is sometimes referred to as momentariness, that things exist for a moment only. Actually, they don't even do that. If it's absurd, if we think like that, because how short is a moment? How long is a moment? What is it, 10 to the minus 44 or something? The Planck constant. How small can you go? The world must be awfully busy if it's remaking itself every 10 to the minus 44 of a second. That just sort of does my head in to think like that. In other words, that there is an inherent absurdity in momentariness if we conceive of it as a quantity. It's not a quantity. It's thinking about things in another way. It's thinking about things in the sense of not being made. There is no truth, no lie. There's a brilliant sea of clouds. There is a dignified sea of clouds. And in many contexts, there is truth. There is lie. There's things that are denied that in fact took place. And that matters. But there's a difference between, as it were, our action, that where we try to, as it were, defend truth in that kind of sense, which sometimes we need to do. But we haven't identified with that truth in the sense of this is me. And if this goes the other way, then I'm totally lost. Or, I am totally destroyed if my truth is not recognized, if I don't have, if my truth isn't there, isn't up there, isn't, the thing. Or isn't in our more recent terms, who you vote for, or who you kind of identify, what sort of religion you identify with, and all of that. This is all coming out of that sense of the need to defend something here. And there is no truth, no lie. There is a brilliant sea of clouds, there is a dignified sea of clouds. Let our response be the dignified sea of clouds, the brilliant sea of clouds, as best we are able. And in doing that, we don't need to make identities. We can see that there's something more than that. And we have, in one sense, a basis for that. We have a practice. We have, if you like, a faith. We have the possibility, at least, of a confidence, a reality confidence. But what I mean by that is we're putting our confidence in the nature of the real. In other words, the unconstructed. that which does not depend on another thing to make it. And if it doesn't depend on another thing, you can never grasp it. And yet, it is reality. Okay, so I'm going to end there. And you're welcome to, if any of you have some questions, I'll do my best to answer. Yes.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful. I'm quite new to Buddhism, so excuse the naivety of this. Is the question, what's the role of free will in this, invalid?
I think we have to understand will. And I think when I look at why did I do X or Y, I can see multiple reasons why. When I think of my will, well, I had certain experiences growing up as a child, positive experiences mostly. Like, this varies hugely from one person to another. And those experiences will affect my will. How have people responded to me recently? That will affect my will, the choices that I make, the way that I give expression to this sense of self. In other words, to see that will is a construct. It's not like something that is stands alone. If we're talking about will in the sense of taking that as being the essence of us and the giving expression to the essence of us, of myself, there's a sense in which we kind of lose track of the brilliant sea of clouds, the dignified sea of clouds, because we take refuge in a constructed thing that actually comes from all the sum total of experiences that we've had in life. That's what makes this thing here. And that needs compassion in the sense of it needs understanding, it needs recognition. But do we come to who we really are by a study of that will? I think we come, if we look at it from the perspective of Zazen, it kind of becomes elusive. It kind of, well, all right, somebody, I don't know, criticises me and I respond in a certain way. And well, I can see maybe after the event that, well, I was afraid. And I responded to them partly out of fear, maybe partly out of a whole number of other motives as well. There's a whole gaggle of things that come together in that moment of response. When you say my will, well, actually, it's a will of something much more than that. It's an expression of, in the end, it's an expression of the world. I mean, the world as sort of, if you like, funneled through this thing here. All that has gone on in the past. It's not something that I can pick out my will from that. There's something here that is flowing through, but the identity doesn't really adhere in that if you look closely. So I think that changes the question in the sense of can there really be such a thing as my will? Can there not? Well, I think to deny free will is a problem. Because if we do that, we say, well, you have no choice. You cannot, to talk about keeping the precepts is meaningless if you deny free will, because it takes something from us to commit, to say, yes, I want to try to live in this way as we need to. That we see something that we feel isn't right, we want to change that thing. We need to exert ourselves, something is there. But it's also like to see that we see it like that because of this, and this, a zillion other things that come together. And so in a kind of temporary sense, in a kind of relative sense, we have will, and we need to know how to use it. But if we then take that will as being, as it were, something that is actually, as it were, the self-definition of ourselves, we make it something more than it is. It's something more than the arising of conditions here and now. That, if you like, our best effort is to do the best we can with the conditions as they are. In other words, we try to listen, we try to hear what the call is from the collection of conditions that we are conscious of, that we are aware of, and we try. Our wish is to make the best response we can to that. But it can happen more if we're open to those conditions, if we're not dividing those conditions. So in one way, typically Buddhist annoying answer, I can say, yes, on the one hand, there is free will, and on the other hand, there isn't free will. But I think if you explore the context of that, it's in a similar kind of way when the Buddha was asked, is there a self in the end, or is there not a self? He refused to answer, because either one isn't quite right. And I think it's rather similar when it comes to will.
Thank you. Thanks.
Anyone else?
Master, is there something about when we say bodhicitta, it came up when you were describing, as it were, this responsive nature, which isn't looking for limitation through identity or anything like that. It's rather the true. That's its motivation. And is when we say trust the practice, trust the process, as it were, is it something in not to make an identity of bodhicitta, but there is something of that movement or current that we're looking to align with, or something?
Yes. I think there's what I've the way I've explained things today is I've been studying a particular scripture recently, which tends to come out in this particular way. It's the Edward Conze's translation of the Prajna Paramita in 8,000 lines. It's a sort of orange cover book some of you may know. And that's one of the earliest Mahayana texts that we have. It's a sort of forerunner of the scripture of great wisdom that we have. And as Buddhism developed, especially in the Mahayana, we have ideas like bodhicitta, we have ideas like Buddha nature that aren't mentioned in this earlier text. And what I think those words and those ideas and are trying to do is it's like trying to say it does embrace every treasure. And when we speak of Buddha nature, it's like saying there's something, there's sort of human nature and Buddha nature. Oh, hang on, that's can't be quite right if there's no division. And yet, sometimes when we think about Buddha nature, we actually make that split in our minds that, all the horrible bits belong to human nature and all the good bits belong to Buddha nature. And yet, I think as Buddhism has gone on, as teaching goes on, in some way or another, we need to affirm it's not really quite enough to just say, emptiness, that's it. In one way, that's true. and yet that would give you I think a mistaken impression awfully easily. And so we have, I think, different traditions have emerged, our own included, that uses terms like Buddha nature much more freely. But I think it's sometimes useful to go back to see the context in which that came from. Otherwise, what we can do is just Buddha nature just becomes a surrogate self. My Buddha nature. I want to make sure that my Buddha nature is respected, or that my well, hang on, we're back to square one, aren't we? And it's awfully easy for us to identify with something like that, and it becomes, if we're not careful, it becomes a sort of I don't know, a personification almost of that which is up there, and I'm down here. When really what we're aiming to see is the undivided nature. And I think there is a value in words like Buddha nature. There's a value in pointing to bodhicitta, because there is right action in the end. There is something that is, as it were, good to do. But if we kind of grab onto the good to do in that sort of self-identifying way, I am doing good. Well, okay, I mean, this is the sort of way that people who sort of identify as a what's the word? Who give lots of money to good causes and so on. Yeah, philanthropy. Yeah, that's right. There's something good about that. Of course, there is. But for the individual, it can also be, well, I'm all right. I've given X million, whatever, to this, that, and the other, and I can feel good about that. Well, yes, there's something there that's good, and not, but it's on that. It's only going to go so far. Because when you're dying, none of that makes any difference at all. And it's not to say that none of it is, that it wasn't worth doing. It was worth doing. It was important. And it's far better that you gave the money than that you didn't. Yes, but there's something about the end of suffering where we realise that none of this mattered in the first place. It really didn't. That actually there's a freedom beyond imagining. And I don't mean that in some sort of, it's beyond imagining sort of way. I mean it's beyond imagining. You cannot imagine it. You cannot imagine it. You can only be it. And you can only be it by, not holding on in that kind of a way. And in my experience, you can only, and it's gone, because I'm doing it again, And okay, so on we go. So now I can see that bit, hopefully a little bit clearer, so I can let that go. And it grows, and one sense of where this comes from, how this develops. Yes, we call that bodhicitta, yes. And that's another bodhi is enlightenment, citta is mind, so enlightened mind. And then, and again, take care. In the scripture I've been studying, the Buddha says there is no enlightened mind. There is no Buddha. And everything that you would think it was, he says, no. And what he's saying is that you could rephrase that to some extent and say that there's no conception of these things. That a bodhisattva, he asks Subhuti, who's the sort of main exponent in the scripture, to describe what it is to be a bodhisattva. And Subhuti says, well, I don't see any bodhisattva. How can I say what a bodhisattva is when I see no bodhisattva? And the Buddha's response was, yes, Subhuti, that's true. And someone who can hear that and not be frightened, that person is on the path of being a bodhisattva. And that person has the teaching in the sense they have all they need in order to explore the teaching. Because, in other words, what that's saying is that if we come to the sitting and we experience a fear of, oh, I'm losing myself. But then we are willing to stand, or in this case sit, in that place without running away. We can be fearful, but like anger, fear doesn't have to be the dividing thing. Our fear is the brilliant sea of clouds as well. We have to let our fear be the dignified sea of clouds. That is, don't be, exciting it, adding to it or whatever. Just that we can. It's it goes beyond right and wrong. If we're fearful, we're fearful. But just to be present with our fear, and already it's changed. If we're just with it, already it's not, as it were, to start with. It's like and something sort of retreats, but then no, and then we kind of come back. We're present. We're not making that division like that. And so, in a sense, we can know fear more deeply. While our reaction to fear is something that sort of can't feel it, can't know it, can't let ourselves actually be with it. And I think we find our path through being with what at the first instance seems to be the negative. But if you can be with your anger, your fear, your desires, etc., you can know them in a way that you never can know them if there's barriers that are no, I don't do that, I only do this. And through the seeing of it, you are, what is your sense of who you are is changed in that. Bits dissolve, maybe not completely to start with, it takes time, but gradually, the more this happens, there's that shift. The world is less me, you, and the world is just, it goes beyond language at that point. And I suppose the closest was there is nothing to grasp. And in not grasping, there is every treasure.
As I was listening to you, and I think something you said, or some other teacher, I think you said, sitting Buddha when we do Zazen. And I see a connection between that and what you said, but would like to hear your comments about this.
Okay, yeah. Yes, well, it is. I suppose what I mean by the every treasure is that it is, yes, sitting Buddha. And I think it's fairly obvious that if we grasp that Buddha, it goes through our fingers. And yet it is sitting Buddha. And it's the thing about it is it's sitting Buddha even if we do grasp it. The difference is that we disconnect in some way through our grasping. It doesn't actually affect Buddha.
As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about vulnerability,
Mm-hmm.
and the process seems to, or training seems to require, or I don't know if it requires it, but it seems, I experience quite a lot of vulnerability. And I suppose I'm just asking, is that part of the treasure house? But yeah, is it?
I think so, because in some ways, I think how would it be if we didn't have vulnerability? In the sense, if I'm so certain of where I am, what I'm doing, and of what I'm teaching, and all the rest of it, something's a bit off there. I would think. So in one way, our vulnerability is in a sense our knowledge that there's nothing to hold on to here, and that is scary. And I think for me it's been important to recognise, I am scared by this, and I am scared by the loss of those things that I had thought were what was really going to sustain me. And there's a fear that I will lose love, I will lose the people I care about, all those things that are so, deeply important to us. And there is, when you love, there is vulnerability. And in a sense, I think there is a need to recognize, almost to absorb the vulnerability, to recognize that you can't love without risk, without, in a sense, whatever it is that this is, that in a way some sort of offering is made of it. And one of the things that we're taught as monks is that you open your mat, and in the bowing mat we use, and there's an invitation to beings to join you on your mat. And as my teacher put it, sometimes they wipe their muddy feet. Yes, we're vulnerable. And am I capable of being hurt? Yes, I am. I know I am. And there's something sort of like that in accepting that vulnerability, something also goes beyond the vulnerability. I still seem to remain vulnerable. I seem to be more emotional than I was before, in the sense of I react to the sadness of things or the joy of things in ways that, frankly, awkward sometimes, quite often. And there's something about that I don't seem to have that much control over it. It seems to be what happens. So, if you like, the effort is okay. Well, that's what goes on. So, well, okay, let's just make this work in some kind of a way. In other words, that I don't need to cut that out. I can be vulnerable to that, and in being vulnerable to it, it's like it can take its place in the scheme of things. That my frailty as a human being can have a place in the scheme of things, and that is expressed through my vulnerability. My connection with that is through the vulnerability. And I think there's something about that sort of also gives us strength, because the vulnerability that is sort of acknowledged, it doesn't mean that the vulnerability is in charge. If you know, I'm not quite sure what is in charge, that there is another thing in charge, but the vulnerability doesn't have to be the thing. I can feel vulnerable, but then it may still be possible to do something that I feel vulnerable anyway. You know what I mean? So I think the principle here, I think, is that it is vital that we acknowledge, that we, as it were, give place, give sort of almost like a home to our feelings, whatever they are. Acknowledgement of the feelings, and then out of that can come what is good. It doesn't mean to say that we, like if I have some outrageous sexual desire or something, but no, I don't rush off and do that. But on the other hand, if I don't acknowledge that and give it its place, well then it's sort of almost like I'm cooking ready to burst. But by acknowledging it and recognising it, it's sort of like it can move, it can change. It can be what it needs to be. So there's something here, I think. It's occurred to me that in our tradition, we don't deal in antidotes. I don't mean to make this a sort of, I put it like that's maybe the wrong way to put it, but of course there are antidotes, and of course antidotes can be useful. But what I mean by this is if I'm feeling anger, to try to generate compassion in response to my anger, it's sort of like, I'm trying to balance the scales. That is one, I think there can be a very positive practice, which is just be with the anger. Let the anger show you what it really is. Or, in this case, let the vulnerability show you what it is. And there's something about the vulnerability that reflects the complete openness of it all. And somehow that because as that is accepted, there's something about the what I referred to earlier as sort of reality confidence. It's no longer quite self-confidence, that's not quite descriptive. It's that we trust this to the universe, and knowing that we're vulnerable, we can be killed, we can be hurt. All that can happen, and yet, does that really, in some sense, it doesn't really matter. I don't count for anything, therefore it doesn't matter. That's not what I'm saying. Is there something that knowing the ungraspable, I don't have to use language, but knowing the ungraspable in that sort of intuitive, direct sense, none of this matters in the way that it all matters so deeply and profoundly when we don't know that. Because it's like all we've got is the illusion. And so we're all the time trying to build and make and maintain an illusion. And we begin to realise, I don't have to do that. I really don't have to do that. There's sort of something can kind of let go, and then our relationship to our vulnerability can change. Whereas otherwise it's kind of locked in there. Yeah.
Well, we've been going over an hour of mastering.
Okay,
Should we
good.
maybe stop?
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Stop.